Every nation has its protectors, but every protector has a beginning. This is the story of a man whose legacy would stretch across the soil of South Africa and echo through the voices of every soldier under his command. Long before he was a commander, he was a barefoot boy in a dusty rural village in Limpopo province. He would rise early to help his grandfather till the land, his hands in the dirt, his eyes always on something farther, a dream seated not in privilege, but in discipline. In the evenings, while others played, he sat alone by a flickering black and white television, mesmerized by old military documentaries. He wasn't watching for violence, he was learning about strategy, courage, and leadership. By the time he was 13, his notebooks were filled with sketches of battle formations and handwritten quotes from historical generals. At 16, he submitted his application to the South African National Defence Forces Military Academy. A bold move for a village boy with no connections and no special favors. He was accepted. At 17, he arrived, the youngest, the weakest, and the most underestimated of his class. During his first physical test, he collapsed on a 5-kilometer run. But not once did he consider quitting. Over the next 4 years, he became known for something rare, the quiet strength of a man who didn't need to speak to lead. He graduated top of his class in field tactics, navigation, and crisis response. He spoke 4 languages, Zulu, Xhosa, English, and Afrikaans, so he could lead any unit in the field. Instructors saw something in him, not just a soldier, but a future commander. At age 22, he was sent on his first deployment, a peacekeeping mission in a volatile region in Central Africa. When a senior officer was incapacitated during an ambush, the young lieutenant took command under fire. He refused to respond with brute force. Instead, he worked with local guides, used smoke decoys, and created silent extraction routes. His tactics prevented a civilian massacre and saved the lives of over 40 troops. Veterans, watching from afar, were stunned. Back home, the military took notice. He received his first national medal that year, and he didn't say a word to the press. As the years passed, his rise was meteoric. At 27, he was promoted to battalion commander, one of the youngest in South African history. Offers came in from NATO, from private contractors, even from the United Nations. He refused them all. "My uniform belongs to my country," he said once. Unlike many high-ranking officers, he refused private protection. He marched with his men. Slept beside them. Ate what they ate. And bled when they bled. Soldiers who served under him say they would follow him into any fire, not because he was fearless, but because he was human. Now, at 45, he faces the greatest challenge of his life. A rising regional conflict threatens to destabilize the borders of South Africa. Multiple factions, armed with foreign weapons and internal agendas, are pushing into strategic zones. The entire military has been placed on high alert. In the capital, behind locked doors, the national leadership holds its breath. At the center of it all is this commander, the boy from Limpopo, now standing before a full war council. Maps stretch across the table. Red markers. Satellite feeds. Troop estimates. Time is running out. And yet, as he stands before his officers, there is no panic in his voice. "This is not my war," he says firmly. "This is our responsibility. Our duty. And we will not fail the people who sleep under the flag we wear." His words aren't theatrical. They don't need to be. His presence is enough. As he steps out of the war room, the camera follows his boots. Now weathered by 3 decades of walking with the weight of leadership. Soldiers begin to assemble. Convoys prepare. Communications light up. The war has not yet begun, but the spirit of the army is already in motion. For this is not just a battle for land, it is a battle for peace. And the man leading them has been preparing for this moment his entire life. The call came just after dawn. A threat was no longer theoretical, it was now visible, measurable, and dangerously real. Intelligence reports confirmed an armed insurgency growing in the northern border regions. Satellite imagery showed convoys of hostile vehicles moving toward key South African infrastructure zones. It was a mosaic of chaos, multiple factions, no clear leader, and foreign money behind their weapons. This wasn't just a rogue militia, it was a calculated destabilization. Within hours, the National Emergency Protocol was activated. And at the center of it, once again, stood the black South African commander, now given full operational control of the national defense effort. The army wasn't ready, not yet. But under his direction, it would be. The first step was coordination. Military bases across the country received classified transmissions. Commanders at every level were summoned. Unit leaders were briefed, maps updated, codes synchronized. Across every province. Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Free State, Gauteng, sleeping barracks stirred. Sirens called men and women out of their beds and onto their feet. Uniforms were donned in silence. Boots hit the floors. Radios lit up. It wasn't panic. It was purpose. Inside a secure military compound near Pretoria, the commander stood before a digital map that spanned the length of an entire wall. Drones flew across the borders every 15 minutes. Live feeds updated the landscape in real time. He and his closest advisors spent hours dissecting enemy movement patterns, mapping safe supply corridors, and identifying civilian populations at risk. Every red dot on the screen represented lives. He didn't see enemies, he saw the duty to protect. Every plan he approved was built around minimizing bloodshed, both military and civilian. That, he believed, was the difference between a soldier and a warrior. Then came the speech, the one that would ripple through the military like a wave of steel. The commander stood in front of a national broadcast to all branches of the armed forces. No podium. No flourish. Just a simple camera and a room full of generals. His voice was calm, but his words carried power. "We do not go to war to conquer," he began. "We go to war because peace is being threatened. We go as protectors, not as destroyers. Every soldier in this army carries not just a weapon, but a promise. A promise to defend those who cannot defend themselves. If we stand together. If we move as one." The effect was immediate. Soldiers who were weary became focused. Officers who were hesitant became resolved. Young recruits, many of them fresh out of training, felt the weight of their responsibility, but not the fear. Across the nation, military infrastructure shifted into high gear. Trucks loaded with gear rolled onto highways. Helicopters began patrol flights along key ridges. Naval units moved into position off the coasts. The entire armed force of the Republic of South Africa, over 100,000 strong, began to move like one living organism, beating with a single purpose. In bases and staging areas, new recruits were briefed. Maps were unrolled. Equipment was cleaned and counted. Medics began checking field kits. Tactical radios were calibrated. Specialized teams reviewed infiltration routes, counter-IED procedures, and extraction protocols. In remote deserts and valleys, small units began practicing close-quarter drills. Under the burning sun, soldiers rehearsed for an enemy they had not yet seen, but would soon face. Meanwhile, the commander didn't sleep. He visited base after base, not for show, but to walk among his men. In one scene, he is seen kneeling beside a young sergeant nervously checking his rifle. "It's not the weapon that will save you," he tells him. "It's the brother beside you. Stay close to your unit. Stay alert. Stay alive." He knew every face mattered. Every soldier was someone's child, someone's partner, someone's future. As day turned to night, the full scale of preparation became clear. South Africa was not retreating. It was rising. Not with chaos, but with coordination. Not with vengeance, but with vigilance. There was no room for glory. Only responsibility. The commander reviewed troop formations again, light infantry in the front, armored units behind, mobile artillery positioned on elevated terrain. Communications hubs were placed in hardened shelters. Air support rotations were defined. Every inch of the battle plan was double-checked. He didn't trust chance. He trusted precision. And through it all, the commander remained a silent pillar. Watching. Guiding. Calculating. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike a dramatic pose. But every soldier who saw him, every officer who stood in the same room, felt the shift. The war hadn't begun yet. But the army was now awake. Trained. Aligned. Focused. It had a heart. It had a spine. And it had a leader who understood the weight of command better than anyone alive. As hour 2 ends, the scene fades to night. Soldiers rest with their rifles beside them. Armored vehicles are lined like sleeping giants under moonlight. And the camera pulls back, revealing the vast landscape now covered by one of the most disciplined, professionally prepared military mobilizations in African history. The battle may still lie ahead. But South Africa is no longer waiting. It is ready. Strategic formation. The third hour marked the beginning of clarity. The fog of "what if" had lifted, replaced by the certainty of when and where. The South African commander now stood not just as a military leader, but as a master strategist. In war, success isn't defined by the number of soldiers or weapons, it is defined by position, timing, and coordination. And now, with the nation's full force prepared, the commander began to shape the battlefield before the first shot was ever fired. From a high-security war room in Johannesburg, his fingers moved across a touchscreen battle map like an artist with a brush. Green and red markers lit up across the screen, showing enemy positions, choke points, civilian zones, and logistical routes. He didn't just look at the terrain. He read it like scripture. Hills were not obstacles, they were cover. Rivers were not barriers, they were traps for the undisciplined. Every valley was a place of risk. Every bridge was a target. Every open plain, a calculated gamble. He began issuing coordinated deployment orders to all branches. Mechanized units moved out first, massive armored columns rumbling through mountain passes in Limpopo and Northern Cape. Light infantry squads deployed into forested highlands to intercept possible insurgent flanks. In the Karoo region, long-range artillery was dug in and camouflaged, given GPS coordinates to strike at a moment's notice. And far to the east, naval patrols intensified their perimeter control along the Indian Ocean, ready to cut off any incoming foreign support for the insurgents. It wasn't just troop movement, it was chess. High-level, three-dimensional chess across thousands of kilometers. But it was more than military brilliance, it was cultural brilliance. The commander understood the people of the regions, the languages spoken, the fears that rose in rural farming towns. He authorized community defense units to be formed. Not militias, but trained volunteers working in sync with the military. This wasn't just a show of force, it was a strategy of unity. In war, hearts must be won just as much as battles. Then came the formations. A sweeping defensive crescent was formed across the northern belt of the country. Infantry dug trenches and defensive walls. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead like hawks. Mobile air defense units rolled into key cities. But behind that shield, a silent sword was forming, a rapid response unit made up of elite rangers, paratroopers, and combat engineers. They were the tip of the spear, trained for counterinsurgency in urban and rural zones. No one knew when or where they'd be sent, only that when the time came, they would strike with speed and surgical precision. At one base, a team of female intelligence officers cracked encrypted insurgent communications and intercepted shipment plans. In another, cyber warfare specialists began digital counter-operations to disrupt hostile propaganda and command channels. This war wasn't just boots on the ground, it was satellites in space, algorithms in bunkers, and quiet operatives watching through cameras no one could see. Meanwhile, the commander remained a figure of relentless resolve. He didn't sleep, not because of pride, but because of responsibility. He walked perimeter lines, inspected field kitchens, and shared meals with soldiers in wind-blown tents. To a group of young recruits, he said, "The enemy is not just outside. Sometimes, the enemy is fear. Sometimes, it's doubt. But together, we overcome both." The army began to feel it, the cohesion, the trust, the quiet discipline. They weren't scattered units anymore. They were an organism. A shield. A hammer. A living force bound by purpose. As air squadrons roared overhead and convoys stretched for kilometers down dusty highways, it became clear, South Africa was not waiting for the war to come to them. It was preparing to meet the enemy with strength, unity, and precision. As the sun set over the fortified ridgelines, the camera pans wide. You see a land defended, not by chance, but by design. Troops on rooftops, artillery waiting beneath camouflage nets, UAVs blinking silently in the dusk sky. The music builds. The silence between soldiers says more than words. And the voice of the commander, strong and steady, echoes in the background. We fight not because we want war. We fight so that one day, our children won't have to. And as Hour 3 closes, all across the continent, the balance of power begins to shift. Because now, strategy has taken form. And the commander, once a boy from the village, has become the architect of South Africa's defense. The first clash, fire and resolve. The fourth hour shattered the calm like thunder on dry ground. Everything that had been prepared, the strategies, the deployments, the lines drawn on digital maps, was now being tested against the raw, chaotic fury of war. Before dawn, a coded alert pierced the silence at Command HQ. A forward operating base near the Lesotho border had been breached. Explosions rocked the valley, tracer fire lit up the morning mist, and the airwaves became a storm of overlapping radio signals. The commander didn't flinch. In war, panic is a poison, and he had none in his blood. Instead, he issued a single phrase. Phase 1. Engage. Within seconds, elite air units were in motion. Rooivalk helicopters streaked through the mountain sky, while cheetah fighters scrambled from hidden runways. On the ground, mechanized infantry surged toward the red zone, engines growling like beasts awakened. The commander watched every feed, thermal scans, drone footage, live soldier cams. And with every passing second, he adjusted tactics like a conductor guiding a living, breathing war symphony. The enemy came hard. Trained, fast, well-funded, and ruthless. Insurgents used guerrilla tactics, ambushes in dense brush, IEDs on transport routes, snipers hidden in civilian homes. They knew the terrain well. But they didn't know the army was ready for a fight like no other. The commander's forces executed Hammer Protocol, a two-tiered assault involving frontal resistance and a sweeping side attack by stealth ranger units. These elite soldiers, trained in bush warfare, struck from unexpected directions, neutralizing command posts, cutting off retreat paths, and recovering stolen weapons caches. Satellite intel fed the minute-to-minute enemy movement, turning every skirmish into a calculated strike. In the chaos, a young unit leader, Captain Langa, emerged as a frontline hero. With only 40 soldiers and limited ammo, she held a mountain checkpoint against an enemy 10 times their number for 5 straight hours. Her voice crackled through the radio. "We're not retreating. We are the wall." Word of her stand rippled through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Soldiers who had never seen real combat felt their hearts steel with her courage. And when the enemy attempted to encircle her, reinforcements arrived just in time, airborne commandos rappelling into the trees, clearing hostiles with precision and reclaiming the base by dusk. But victory came with cost. Medics rushed through triage zones. Smoke rose from downed tanks. Helicopters evacuated the wounded under a blood-red sky. In that moment, the reality of war returned. It was no longer strategy, it was sacrifice. And still, the commander did not break. That evening, he walked among the soldiers at the battlefield encampment, boots muddy, eyes steady. He didn't offer false hope. He offered truth. This was our first test. You passed not because you were stronger, but because you stood together. The enemy expected confusion. You gave them resolve. He met the gaze of every unit leader, every wounded fighter, every volunteer medic. His presence didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it into purpose. Far away, in media control rooms and encrypted communications channels, the footage of the defense effort went viral. The world began to see that South Africa wasn't a fractured state begging for help. It was a nation of warriors. And its people, black, white, rural, urban, stood behind a single flag, a single voice, a single vision. The enemy withdrew for now, shaken by the resistance and the speed of response. But the commander knew it was only a beginning. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was the opening chapter of a longer, darker campaign. As hour 4 closed, night fell over the ridges. Fires burned low. Soldiers leaned on one another. And in a quiet room beneath the command center, the commander lit a candle before the map table. "Tomorrow, they'll try again," he whispered to no one but himself. "And we'll be ready. Stronger. Smarter. Together." Broken terrain, unbroken spirit. Morning came without peace. The land was quiet, but the silence felt like pressure before a storm. The enemy had retreated, but not defeated. Intelligence reports confirmed what the commander had already sensed: a large insurgent force was regrouping in the Central Highlands, possibly reinforced by foreign mercenaries and rogue arms dealers. What was once a defensive operation was now on the verge of a full-scale counteroffensive. The time for holding ground was over. Now, it was time to move. But the terrain ahead was treacherous: rocky escarpments, dense savannas, and dry riverbeds that twisted unpredictably. No highways. No easy access. If war was going to be fought there, it would be inch by inch. The commander summoned his top battalion leaders and reconnaissance scouts. Maps were unrolled across dirt tables and field tents, marked with enemy coordinates and rumored hideouts. His voice was calm, calculated. "They want us to chase them blind. We'll move like smoke. Not a storm, an eclipse." He ordered Operation Silencer, a multi-pronged maneuver across 3 provinces with the goal of surrounding and neutralizing the insurgent corps without igniting panic among civilians. It would require mobility, stealth, and the trust of local communities along the way. The army split into smaller mobile task units. Heavy armor was left behind. This was not a war of machines, it was a war of men, landscape, and will. Units moved by foot, light trucks, and stealth helicopters flying low through dawn fog. Drones buzzed overhead like wasps, gathering intel and sending live feeds back to HQ. In every small village they passed, the army left behind medicine, food, and radio contact. This wasn't just combat, it was coalition building. As they pushed deeper into rugged interior zones, soldiers encountered ambushes laid with devastating precision: booby-trapped carcasses, fake refugee camps used as bait, and even explosive-laced wells. 2 platoons were caught in a narrow canyon, their path blocked and communications jammed. The commander personally coordinated their rescue, ordering a paratrooper drop from 2,000 feet through a nighttime windstorm. The operation was risky, but successful. Every soldier was recovered. Not one was left behind. In the middle of it all was Staff Sergeant Thilani, a former miner-turned-elite scout. With unmatched knowledge of the local terrain, he led his unit through ancient cattle paths, guiding them by starlight and instinct. When enemy scouts intercepted a convoy carrying humanitarian supplies, it was Thilani's team that ambushed them from above, disabling their vehicles and capturing their commander alive. His act turned a small mission into a strategic victory, as the prisoner revealed a secret plan to attack a major water reservoir, one that supplied 3 entire districts. With only hours to act, the army launched a rapid redeployment. Engineers raced to reinforce the dam's perimeter, while sharpshooters took position on high ground. The insurgents arrived at sunset, expecting surprise. Instead, they found hellfire, directed machine fire, claymores, and air support coordinated by the commander himself via mobile command hub. The attack was repelled. The reservoir saved. That night, in a makeshift command post lit by lanterns and battery-powered computers, the commander gathered his officers for debrief. The air was heavy with exhaustion, but also pride. Maps were updated. Medics tended to the wounded. Ammo was restocked. And yet, their faces showed something new. Unity. Respect. Fire. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were guardians of a nation's future. As the camera pans wide, showing convoys snaking through vast grasslands under moonlight, the voiceover returns. He didn't win the war today. But he turned the tide. Not with bombs. But with belief. Not just in himself, but in his people. And as hour 5 fades out, we see the commander standing at a ridgeline, overlooking the broken terrain behind them, and the uncertain roads ahead. His jaw is clenched. His heart is steady. His purpose is now absolute. We are not chasing shadows anymore, he says to his second-in-command. We are walking straight into them, with the light at our back. The enemy within. The 6th hour opened with an eerie calm. The dust had settled after the Highland battles, and for the first time in days, the maps showed no movement. It felt wrong. The commander stood silently in the command tent, staring at the operational screen. No chatter on intercepted channels. No patrol reports from insurgent scouts. It was too quiet. The battlefield had gone dark, and that, he knew, meant something was coming. But from where? Then, the first breach came. Not from outside. From within. A sudden explosion tore through a fuel depot at Base Echo 7, killing 6 soldiers and grounding a fleet of transport trucks. 20 minutes later, a communication jammer knocked out radio contact between 2 regional units. Chaos rippled through the ranks. But this wasn't a strike from insurgents. It was sabotage. Internal. The commander ordered an immediate lockdown of all secure installations. Officers were pulled from their duties for background checks. Field communications were rerouted through analog backups. A covert investigation began, and within hours, the truth started to unravel. 2 junior officers, recently transferred in from another province, had been secretly relaying supply and movement data to an external proxy group. They weren't loyalists. They were plants. Paid, embedded, and patient. Their goal hadn't been to fight openly. It was to dismantle South Africa's defenses from the inside. For the commander, it wasn't just betrayal. It was personal. He had built this army on trust, across race, language, and background. He had trained them not just to fight, but to believe in one another. And now that unity had been cracked. But he didn't respond with vengeance. He responded with clarity. He summoned every regional unit commander to a closed war council. In that moment, surrounded by leaders who looked up to him not just as a general, but as the spirit of their fight, he spoke plainly. They will try to break us. Not just from the outside, but from inside our walls, our ranks, our hearts. But if we fall to doubt, we lose more than battles. We lose what we fight to protect. So let's make something clear, loyalty is not given, it's earned. And ours will be tested. He launched Operation Iron Root, a total security reform. Digital firewalls were redrawn. Intelligence branches embedded counter-intel officers within every base. Behavioral patterns were monitored. Every supply truck was double-verified. Every encrypted message logged. Soldiers were no longer just warriors. They were guardians of integrity. But this wasn't about paranoia. It was about protection. The enemy wasn't just men with rifles anymore. It was ideas, corruption, division, fear. And fear spreads faster than fire. While the investigation expanded, the enemy struck again, this time at the public. A media hack released fake footage showing South African soldiers attacking civilians. Within minutes, social media exploded with rage. Riots flared in small towns. International headlines began to turn. Doubt seeped into homes. The commander went on live national broadcast, raw, unedited, unfiltered. The truth matters. In war, even more than bullets. We did not start this fight. But we will not let lies finish it. He released the original footage. He invited journalists to embed with military units. He opened the doors. Because he knew something the enemy didn't, transparency is a weapon, one they couldn't use. His gamble worked. Public support returned. Town leaders issued open letters of unity. Volunteer forces in border villages increased. Students posted solidarity messages. The nation wasn't broken, it was wounded. But now it was healing. And through it all, the commander never flinched. Even when 2 more officers were arrested. Even when the news labeled it a fractured army. He kept moving. Quietly. Decisively. Reforming. Retraining. Rebuilding morale. Because sometimes, war isn't won with a rifle. It's won with a mirror. And as hour 6 closed, a new kind of order had emerged, not one of blind trust, but earned loyalty. The kind that survives storms. The kind that turns warriors into legends. In a quiet moment, the commander stood outside the base, watching stars emerge above the darkened ridgelines. His aide approached and asked, "Sir, what happens if they try this again?" The commander didn't turn. He simply said, "Then we remind them, this army wasn't built in a day. It was built on sacrifice. And no traitor can erase that." The siege of Kuala Basin. The 7th hour began not with an order, but with silence. For 2 days, the insurgents had vanished, melting into the rugged terrain of the Kuala Basin. To most, it seemed like a retreat. To the commander, it was a trap. The Kuala region wasn't just hard to navigate, it was perfectly suited for an ambush: steep hills, thick brush, and narrow passes that swallowed signals and vehicles alike. But deep reconnaissance flights confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The enemy hadn't fled. They were digging in. A full brigade, nearly 3,000 insurgents, supported by foreign-trained engineers and anti-air systems, had entrenched themselves in the basin's valley floor. Trenches. Turrets. Sniper nests. Mortars mounted in camouflaged rock beds. They had turned the land into a fortress. And at the center of it all, intel revealed, was one of the insurgency's key leaders, a former colonel-turned-warlord known only as Kosefu. A ghost from a previous civil war, long believed to be dead. This wasn't just a base. It was their stronghold. The South African National Defense Force could not allow it to stand. The commander studied the terrain for hours, his eyes never leaving the topographic feed. He knew that a frontal assault would lead to devastating casualties. They had to neutralize the stronghold, but they had to do it with minimal loss. He turned to his war council and said, "We don't fight mountains with force. We fight them with patience, precision, and silence." He devised Operation Veilstorm, a layered, phased siege with an invisible hand. Instead of one overwhelming attack, the army would tighten a noose, day by day, hour by hour, until the enemy had nowhere left to run. First came the drones. They flew high, quiet, mapping the enemy positions by infrared signatures. Then came the cyber attacks. The Army's digital warfare unit launched coordinated strikes on the insurgents' comms grid. Scrambling frequencies, planting false movement reports, and creating phantom battalions on enemy radar. At the same time, psychological warfare teams broadcast messages into the valley, offering surrender terms, playing patriotic songs, even leaking misinformation that Kosefu had been killed in an earlier strike. Next, came the siege lines. 4,000 South African troops moved into position across 3 ridgelines. Mortar teams dug in. Snipers found perch points. Medical tents and mobile kitchens followed quietly behind. For 2 days, the army didn't fire a single shot. Instead, they tightened the circle, cutting supply lines, intercepting escape attempts, and planting motion sensors through the terrain. It wasn't war yet. It was a suffocation. But Kosefu didn't break. Instead, on the 3rd night, he struck back, with fire. A coordinated artillery assault came from the basin, targeting one of the eastern flanks. Dozens were wounded. Radio towers were hit. For the first time, the line bent. For the first time, the commander felt the pressure rise. He responded the way only seasoned warriors do, with adaptation. He gave the green light for Black Echo, a night raid by 60 elite rangers equipped with thermal optics and silent approach gear. Their objective, to penetrate the basin, sabotage artillery, and confirm the enemy's true numbers. They moved in just after midnight, crossing marshes and jagged rocks under cover of thunder. The operation was surgical. Explosives were planted. Power nodes were disabled. The Rangers escaped just minutes before dawn with crucial intel. The enemy was low on food. Low on morale. And Kosefu was wounded. The time had come. The full assault began at 0500 hours. Air support launched smoke barrages over enemy trenches. Artillery rained from 3 angles. Infantry moved in tactical waves, supported by field engineers defusing traps. It was a battle of attrition, grit, and endurance. Every meter gained was a meter of blood, sweat, and resolve. Captain Langa, who had become a field legend, led the final breach into the southern corridor. Under fire, with radio static, she directed her team through a shattered compound and cleared building by building until they reached the main bunker. Inside, Kosefu was found slumped, bleeding but alive. The siege was over. The basin was secured. Thousands of weapons were recovered. Dozens of civilians held hostage were freed. The stronghold, the heart of the insurgency, had been shattered. But victory came with a price. The dead were counted under a flag of silence. Graves were dug on the ridge under the red glow of sunset. Soldiers stood in rows. Helmets off. Eyes lowered. And in the middle stood the commander, his boots covered in ash and dust. He said no grand words. Only this. We do not celebrate. We honor. And then we march on. That night, the stars returned over the basin for the first time in weeks. Fires were extinguished. Radios went quiet. And the army, the shield of a nation, stood a little stronger. A little closer. A little more unbreakable. Ghost Front, the war moves underground. The 8th hour began with an uneasy silence, not the silence of peace, but of something unseen, unmeasured, and waiting. After the brutal siege of Kuala Basin, the nation thought the worst was over. The insurgent stronghold had fallen, their forces were scattered, their leader Kosefu taken into custody. But the commander knew better. In war, true enemies don't die with the first defeat, they adapt. Within 48 hours of the siege, strange patterns began to surface. Communications blackouts in distant provinces. Explosions near underused railways. Sudden disappearances of humanitarian convoys in regions untouched by major battle. It was like the enemy had gone invisible. That's when an intelligence operative entered the command tent with a single word that changed the entire war. Tunnels. It wasn't just retreat. The insurgency had gone underground, literally. Intelligence reports revealed a growing network of subterranean passages, carved through abandoned mines, dried riverbeds, and forgotten Cold War bunkers. Smuggling routes from past conflicts had been reactivated, connecting provinces in the shadows. These weren't just hideouts, they were cities beneath the soil. The insurgents were rebuilding below, hidden from air surveillance, immune to artillery. They were striking like ghosts, emerging, hitting, vanishing. The war had entered a new, phantom phase. The commander called an emergency council of engineers, geologists, and urban combat experts. Maps were redrawn, not by elevation, but by depth. Seismic sensors were deployed across the regions. Specialized underground units, sappers, tunnel scouts, and demolition teams, were assembled. It was a war South Africa had never fought before. A war underneath the surface. Operation Deep Pulse was launched. The army began searching, probing, scanning, listening for vibrations. Teams were dropped into collapsed mine shafts. Drones with sonar mapped underground layouts. They found more than tunnels, they found factories, stockpiles, prisons, and makeshift command rooms powered by stolen generators. But the enemy fought dirty in the dark. Booby traps laced passageways. Improvised gas bombs claimed dozens of scouts. Some tunnels were deliberately collapsed while soldiers were still inside. In one chilling broadcast, insurgents live-streamed a captured South African patrol from deep underground, threatening execution if the army advanced. The commander watched that footage, his face unreadable. When it ended, he ordered a silence to fall over the base. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "We don't fear shadows. We fight until there's nowhere left for them to hide." He greenlit Black Soil Protocol, a simultaneous underground offensive across 5 sectors. It wasn't just force, it was finesse. He paired each tunnel squad with psychologists and tech officers. They used sound warfare, ultra-low frequencies to disrupt enemy balance underground. They deployed shock lights to disorient insurgents hiding in pitch black. Some teams used recorded messages from defected insurgents, played through the tunnels to rattle morale. In one breakthrough moment, a tunnel team discovered a central hub beneath a township where insurgent commanders had installed a digital command relay system using stolen satellite gear. A firefight erupted in the darkness. Muzzle flashes danced across the tunnel walls like lightning. The air was thick with dust, blood, and echoes. But the team held their ground. They secured the relay. And in doing so, they cut the insurgents off from their own ghost network. Above ground, civilian support grew stronger. People shared tips. Locals pointed to strange ground tremors or distant rumbling. Farmers reported soil collapse. Even retired miners returned to volunteer, guiding soldiers through the old veins of the land they once worked with pickaxes. The country was no longer just defending itself, it was helping to cleanse itself from within. But the commander knew the war wasn't just below ground anymore, it was entering mines. The longer it dragged on, the more fatigue set in. Soldiers were sleeping 2 hours a night. Supplies were dwindling. Fear, like the tunnels, ran deep. So he did what only true leaders do when morale begins to break, he descended himself. He joined a unit on a critical mission into a newly discovered shaft believed to lead to the final insurgent relay point. He didn't wear his formal insignia. He carried a rifle, wore the same dust-covered gear, and crawled shoulder to shoulder with the men and women who followed him. In that moment, he wasn't a symbol. He was a soldier. One of them. They found the last underground chamber after 7 hours of crawling. It was defended by the last of Kosefu's inner circle. The firefight was brief but vicious. And when the silence returned, the command post was in their hands. They had reached the heart of the underground war. As hour 8 closed, the sun was rising above, warm, golden, wide. But beneath it, hundreds of soldiers were emerging from the tunnels, bloodied and alive. The commander climbed out last, covered in sweat and soot. He looked to the horizon. Not with relief, but with purpose. They thought darkness would save them, he whispered to his second-in-command. But we bring the light with us. The final push, the nation marches. The ninth hour opened with wind sweeping across plains that had once echoed with fire. The tunnels had been cleared. The strongholds shattered. The insurgents' last communication hubs lay in pieces. But still, they hadn't surrendered. And that made the commander's eyes narrow. This wasn't about military control anymore. It was about breaking a belief, the belief that the insurgents could still win. But they were out of hiding now. Desperate, splintered, and regrouping in one final region, the Drakensberg Pass, a brutal stretch of mountains and ancient battlefields. This was where wars in centuries past had ended, or begun again. And now, it was where the final stand would happen. Recon drones circled the ridgelines. Infrared scans picked up signatures, thousands. The last remnants of the insurgency had gathered. Reinforced by foreign mercenaries, ex-soldiers of forgotten wars, and radical loyalists. They were going to make a final stand. Not for territory, but for the message that South Africa could be divided again. The commander gathered his council. The war had taken weeks, cost hundreds of lives, but now it came down to this final strike. His officers stood around the table like stone. Fatigue haunted their eyes. Bandages wrapped their arms. Their maps were worn thin. But they listened. This is not about land, the commander said. It's about legacy. We didn't fight to destroy. We fought to unite. And we end this war not with rage, but with resolve. He issued the order for Operation Horizon Flame. It was the largest coordinated military action in South Africa's modern history. Nearly 25,000 soldiers mobilized, infantry, rangers, armored divisions, artillery, aerial squadrons, and drone fleets. The operation wasn't just about precision, it was about overwhelming force without losing moral control. Convoys rolled down dirt roads. Helicopters thudded over river valleys. Artillery barrels gleamed under tarps. The people came too, farmers offering water, nurses riding in supply trucks, children waving flags on rooftops. This was no longer a government's war. This was the nation marching together. The first strike hit enemy radar installations on the upper cliffs, disabling their watch. Then came targeted air raids, surgical, not scorched earth. Troops advanced from 3 directions. A 4-day battle unfolded. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. It was brutal, physical, and chaotic. Mountains shook. Gunfire echoed through fog. Casualties mounted. But the army did not break. Captain Langa, now a symbol across the military, led her unit through a pass under sniper fire, using smoke and deception to flank the insurgent supply depot. Sergeant Thulani led a night ambush down a ravine, dismantling the enemy's last anti-air battery. Meanwhile, cyber units hacked into mercenary comms, feeding them false retreat orders, splitting their ranks in the dark. At the highest ridge, the enemy's new commander, a foreign war profiteer named Voss, attempted to escape by helicopter. The commander himself called in the intercept. A fighter jet looped through the clouds and locked in. One missile. The sky lit up orange. It was over. By dawn of the 5th day, white flags were raised. Thousands surrendered. Others fled into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The insurgency, once a growing storm, had collapsed beneath the weight of unity and truth. The troops didn't cheer. They stood in silence as the South African flag was raised over the cliffs of Drakensberg. Soldiers held each other. Some wept. Some prayed. Some just stared at the sky. Later that afternoon, the commander walked the field hospital, his uniform dusty, his voice low. He visited the wounded. He sat with the families of the fallen. He said no speeches. Only. They gave us this day. Never forget them. And at headquarters, when the final operational report was handed to him, he didn't even look at it. He passed it back and said, "File it. Then bury it. The war is over. Now we build." As hour 9 closed, the camera pans wide. Hills once burned are now silent. Soldiers disassemble field tents. Medics pack kits. Drones return to hangars. In the distance, civilians begin walking back home, step by step, toward a nation that did not fall. Legacy, what the war left behind. The 10th hour arrived with the stillness of history in the making. The war was over, not just in strategy or on paper, but in hearts. The last insurgent stronghold had fallen. Enemy flags lay folded in the dust. Command posts were dismantled. Yet no victory parade followed. Instead, South Africa paused, not in celebration, but in reflection. The commander stood at the edge of the old battlefield in Drakensberg Pass, where just days before, the earth had shaken under artillery and blood. Now, there was only silence. Morning mist moved slowly across broken stone. Wild birds returned. The land exhaled. Behind him, reconstruction had already begun. Trucks carried lumber and medical supplies. Civil engineers surveyed destroyed bridges. Communication towers were rising again. But the rebuilding of infrastructure was only half the story. The real work was rebuilding trust. Across the nation, people who had once feared one another now stood side by side. Soldiers and civilians, medics and farmers, elders and youth. Communities that had been divided by geography, language, or history now shared one story: they survived together. In classrooms, children began learning not just what happened, but why. New history books were being written. Not about generals or statistics. But about unity. Sacrifice. Leadership. Peace earned through pain. The commander visited a rural village near the old war zone, one that had been on the front lines and nearly wiped out in the early chaos. He walked alone, not in uniform, and sat with the elders beneath a tree. One woman, whose son had died in the war, asked him, "Do you think it was worth it?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the field where children were playing with soccer balls made of wrapped tape. He watched a boy give half his bread to another child, barefoot and quiet. Then he said, "If we never have to fight this war again, then yes." It was. The people didn't cheer. They nodded. Because they understood. At a memorial site in Johannesburg, thousands gathered beneath a granite wall now etched with the names of every fallen soldier, regardless of rank, role, or origin. The commander placed a single white stone at the base and said no words. His silence said everything. Later that night, the president addressed the nation. But it was not her voice that people remembered. It was the voice that came after, the commander's, in a final broadcast played across radio towers and phone screens. "This wasn't my war. This was our stand. Not against a people, but against chaos, greed, and fear. We didn't fight to destroy. We fought so that our children could choose peace instead of war. That is the South Africa we defended. That is the South Africa we now build. Together." As the final hour closed, the camera rose high above the country. It showed schoolyards being painted again. Power restored to hospitals. Roads cleared. Aid delivered. Soldiers helping rebuild homes instead of destroying bunkers. The battlefield had been traded for farmland, classrooms, temples, and town halls. And in one quiet scene, the commander, no longer in uniform, walked through the same village where he once began. He greeted a shopkeeper. Smiled at an old teacher. Hugged a boy who saluted him. His war was done. But his purpose had just begun. Because in the end, legacy isn't left in weapons or medals. It is left in what we protect, and in what we become after the fire fades. Thank you for watching. This wasn't just a story of war, it was a story of strength, unity, and legacy.